Well, we are spending these Sundays during Lent taking a closer look at the Apostle Peter, who was a faithful disciple, despite all of his flaws, and learning what we can discover about being a disciple of Christ from Peter's example. Now, last week we learned about Jesus calling Peter to follow him by telling Peter that he would no longer be fishing for fish, that he would be fishing for people. And I issued a challenge to you last week to go out and get fishing. How'd you do? It's like pop quiz time at school. Remember, it doesn't take a huge amount of bait to fish for people. It can be something as simple as a smile or a hug or a, hey, I know you're going through a hard time. I'm praying for you right now. So keep fishing. Today's story that we're going to look at also has a theme of water, and it's found in Matthew chapter 14, starting with verse 22. Immediately he, this is Jesus, made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. The disciples are on the Sea of Galilee at this point. And after he dismissed the crowds, Jesus went up the mountain to pray. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. And when evening came, he was there alone. But by this time, the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning, he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me!" Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Let's talk about the Sea of Galilee for a few minutes before we start talking about Peter. The sea was also called Lake Kinneret or the Sea of Tiberias in biblical times. The sea is 13 miles from the northern tip to the southern tip, and it's 8 miles across at its widest point. It's 141 feet deep, although at the time of our story, nobody knew how deep it was because they didn't have ropes long enough to tie a weight to the end of the rope and find the bottom. So they had no idea how deep the sea really was. And because of that, because of the mysteriousness of it, some people believed that the depth of the Sea of Galilee was unimaginable, and that it actually was an opening to the underworld. Now, the sea was used as a quick way to get from one place to another. People would hop a boat and sail across the sea rather than spend all the time walking the circumference of it to get to where they needed to be. Excuse me. This is a picture of the Sea of Galilee. This is a picture of what is called the Jesus boat. It's similar to the kind of boat that would have been used at Jesus' time. This particular boat was unearthed in 1986 during a drought in the region. Some amateur archaeologists saw something sticking out of the mud, and when they investigated it, they saw that it was this structure. Now, carbon dating has determined that this boat is from around 40 BC, give or take some decades. So we're fairly certain that this would have been a boat similar to the style that was used in our story, the example in our story. It would have had a single mast with a sail, and it would have carried about 13 people. So this somewhat small boat on a big sea where people didn't know how deep the water was, you can understand where the disciples would have been a little bit concerned. Now, this journey that Jesus sent the disciples on should have only taken a couple of hours, either using the sail or the boats would have had 4 oars, so they could have rowed across the water. But with the storm, the boat was being pushed farther and farther off course. When the winds from the surrounding mountains, as you can see there, when the wind comes over them and down onto the water, the sea actually becomes very dangerous. When we visited the Sea of Galilee last month, our tour guide explained that sometimes a group's itinerary has to be changed because the day that they're supposed to be visiting the Sea of Galilee is too windy and it's not safe to be out on the water. And this is in a large boat with motors. So no doubt there had been deaths on the Sea of Galilee when people in boats had been caught unaware that a storm was coming. And so the disciples' concern and the fear was merited, especially considering that they weren't navigating the waters during the day. They were navigating them in the dark of night. Now, even though Jesus was not with the disciples on the boat, he knew that they were struggling. And he went to them, walking on the water. And it freaked the disciples out. They were scared. Because remember, the Sea of Galilee was thought to be the opening to the underworld. The Jews at the time of Jesus believed that when a person died, their soul went to a place called Sheol, or Hades. And that place was thought to be under the earth. And so when they see Jesus walking across the water, they most likely thought that he was a spirit that had escaped Sheol, and that spirit might be coming to take them back with him. So Jesus speaks to the disciples, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Now, we shouldn't overlook the fact that even though the disciples couldn't see Jesus, even though Jesus wasn't with them, he was watching over them. And he knew that they were in trouble. And he came to them. We need to remember that today, even when we can't see Jesus, and even when we're looking at this big blob that kind of looks like a person with 4 dots in the middle of the face. Even when we can't see Jesus, he knows when we are in trouble, and he still comes to us today. We can face storms just as real as the one the disciples were in. And those storms can frighten us just like the disciples were frightened, because we try to face them by ourselves. But we have to be looking and listening for Jesus. And we have to do that very closely and very carefully, because fear has this way of yelling and screaming over everything else. And it's easy to miss Jesus coming to us and saying, calm down, I'm here. You don't need to be afraid. We just need to scoot over and make room for him in our boat. Let's take a look at Peter a little more closely. Jesus walked out on the water to the boat, told the disciples that it was him, and they don't know whether they should believe what is happening or not. And only Peter is brave enough to speak out. And what does he say? Lord, if it's really you, order me to come to you on the water. What a crazy thing to say. Tell me to get out of the safety of my boat in the middle of a storm and walk on liquid to you. I don't think that's probably what I would have said. It would have probably been like something, Jesus, are you crazy? Get in the boat. Or, would you mind doing something about this storm? But not Peter. Last week we talked a little bit about how sometimes Peter engaged his mouth before he engaged his brain. I wonder if as soon as the words came out, he thought, oh my gosh, what did I just do? I wonder if he immediately regretted that moment where he said, Lord, command me to come to you. Ugh. Or maybe he was just cocky. Well, if Jesus could walk on the water, I can walk on the water too. There's another important detail that we shouldn't overlook here. Before Peter could walk on the water, he had to get out of the boat. Several years ago, John Ortberg wrote a book about this subject and about this specific story. It's a great Bible study. I'd ask your Sunday school teacher, adults, to maybe do that one with you. He's done it before. But he wrote this book called, If You Want to Walk on Water, You Got to Get Out of the Boat. And Ortberg believes that the boat is a metaphor representing safety and security and our comfort zone, where we like to be. Walking on water is a really cool thing, but you can't do it from inside the boat. And Ortberg reminds us that while we sometimes criticize Peter for taking his eyes off of Christ and starting to sink, there were 11 other disciples who didn't even bother to try. There were 11 other disciples that didn't get out of the boat. What is your boat? What does it look like? What is that comfort zone that you are afraid to leave? And how does your failure to leave that boat keep you from experiencing a richer, more fulfilling life? Maybe it's a toxic relationship. Maybe it's a job that you just hate going to. Ultimately, we have to decide if we're going to be led by faith or if we're going to be led by fear. Fear keeps us in the boat with those 11 other disciples, trembling, scared, not particularly happy or fulfilled, because at least we know what to expect when we're in the boat. Now, faith doesn't mean that we know that everything is going to work out exactly like we want it to, but it does mean that we have enough trust to get out of the boat despite our fears. Back to Peter. He steps out of the boat. He's actually walking on water. And then he notices everything else that's going around. He notices the wind. He notices the waves. And he starts to sink. And he cries out, "Lord, rescue me." And Jesus does. But he also questions Peter. "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" Now, Jesus could have been scolding Peter. "Come on, you took your eyes off of me. What are you thinking here?" But I don't know that he necessarily was doing that. Maybe instead he was expressing his disappointment that Peter looked away and allowed doubt to enter rather than stay focused on Christ. I think the parade is starting. I'm going to find myself starting to bob with that music out there. We can find ourselves in the same kind of situation as Peter. Things are going well for him. He was out of the boat. He was walking on water. But then he made a slight miscalculation. He made a little mistake. He lost focus on Christ, and things changed. How many of us have found ourselves in the same situation? Things are going great. We're walking on our own water, whatever that happens to look like for you. And then we take a misstep, or we make a slight mistake, and we start to sink. And we cry out for God's help. But here's where we differ from Peter. We want Jesus to reach down and pull us up out of the storm and make everything better, like he did for Peter. He pulled Peter out of the water, he got him into the boat, and he calmed the storm. And everything was great again. That's what we want. God, rescue us, make everything better so it's nice and calm and smooth. And sometimes Jesus does that for us. But sometimes Jesus leaves us in the water. And we get frustrated and we get angry. And we feel like God has abandoned us. We might even start to feel like God is doing this to us. And we look at stories like Peter being pulled out of the water and wonder if there's anything that we can learn from it except the message that God isn't going to rescue us. He's leaving us put in the water. Here's the lesson. This story gives us a picture of what Jesus does in our lives. Sometimes he pulls us from the water, but sometimes he leaves us in the water and he dives in with us. Either way, Christ is holding on to us saying, "It's me. I'm here. Don't be afraid. You are mine, and you are safe in my arms." So with a promise like that, why are we afraid to get out of our boat? Christ calls each of us, every single one of us, to do something for God's kingdom. He calls every one of us to do something. Now it looks different for each one of us. But God is asking you to do something for him. Last week I challenged you to go fishing. This week let's work on walking on the water. Now, maybe that looks for you like completely getting out of the boat, trusting enough, keeping focused on Christ that you're going to walk on that water. Maybe you're not there yet. That's okay. Maybe right now, getting out of the boat looks for you like taking your toe and just kind of testing out the water. That's okay too. Either way, part of you is out of the boat, just like Peter. Amen.